Today, Chuck and Brock talk about mental representation, Chapter 25, by Professor Panaccio, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy. This is Generous Theology.
Amen. Amen. And I have to point out here that we have to be careful because you and I are Christians. It could be possible, and it even could be easy for us to be giving a pass to Augustine here and the later medieval thinkers who build upon this. It could just be us saying Augustine's in our tribe, and so we're going to overlook the faults of the model that he talks about, and there would be a concern if that's indeed what we were doing. But I think it's important to point out that in all the discussions I've had with non-Christians, for example, and let's just throw out there atheists in particular, I've talked about the history of science in some interactions with atheists. And you can talk all day about the history of scientific theories that are no longer in force, that are no longer credible or held to, as our scientific knowledge has improved and understanding is better. And I have not yet had an atheist say to me that disqualifies science as a valid method of obtaining truth, or even more carefully, obtaining knowledge. That's the better way to say it. And that's because, first of all, both the Christian following this Augustinian framework, as well as the atheist following some secular narrative structure about how science works, in some sense, we are living our faith. And I have this idea that Augustine probably didn't mean things in an uneducated and cartoonishly inadequate way. He probably wasn't a stupid man. Now, the atheist does the same thing when he talks about the scientific methods of the earlier day. Thales thought that everything was water. And if you take a philosophy of science course, they talk about the origins of science. Thales is almost always the starting point. And yet, of course, I could riff on Thales, and I could, of course, mock him and make fun of him. You simple man, you obviously incorrect, uneducated fool, you buffoon, and I could just ride him into the ground for aspects of his theory that clearly don't seem tenable today. Or I could sit back and say, wait a minute here, maybe Thales should not be taken in the most cartoonish fashion possible. And if I do, maybe something will open up to me. Maybe an insight into the world and into my own understanding can be achieved here. And so my point is, let's hold on to this loosely. I don't think any today is necessarily marrying Christianity with the Augustinian model for mental representation. So in other words, because we've moved on from something more advanced from Augustine's idea of mental representative forms, that therefore Christianity must be false. Same thing with science. Just because earlier scientists were wrong about theories doesn't mean that the scientific method is necessarily a bad thing. So we have to factor that, and we have to hold sort of an idea of maturity, also an idea of tentativeness in our scientific investigation of things, as well as just a great deal of humility. Now, I'm going to talk about one of the deep dives in the chapter that I thought was so interesting, and this was Roger Bacon's theory of the multiplication of species. So Bacon's idea is that every existing object continuously irradiates likenesses of itself into the surrounding parts of the universe. And these emanations, called species, ultimately account for every action in the world. So think about what Bacon is saying here. Bacon is saying that objects exist in the world and that they have time and space, location that is relative to each other. Chuck, you exist in your room, in your state. I exist in my room, in my state. And somehow, if Bacon's idea is right, we can communicate and perceive each other because we are both, to some degree, irradiating likenesses of ourselves into the surrounding bits of the universe. And then you pick up on these likenesses. Now, that could seem very strange to people thinking about, let's say, a modern idea of how the senses work. But there are plenty of objects in reality that fit this. And so Bacon, in a specific way, seems to have some insight as to how certain things might be perceived in the world. And so what might some of those things be? Let's think about it. What is it that radiates or irradiates likenesses of itself into the surrounding parts of the universe? First of all, radiation does. So radioactive materials might, in some sense, be said to be close to Bacon's idea here. Now, does that mean that everything in reality is radioactive in the sense that, say, uranium, for example, can be? What about some other ideas? Think about the sense of smell. How does that work? To some degree, you could see Bacon's description here actually being relevant. Hunters know this very well. Hunters are very aware that their bodies produce scents. And when a person walks in a certain place, they leave behind their scent can be caught up on the wind and can be taken downwind, where other people, other animals can pick up on that and receive that stimulation and know and understand, hey, there is a person here. And in fact, our dogs can sniff us out. And so we can actually be found because our dogs have this highly trained nose. And so while it's perhaps not fair to think of Bacon's theory as covering or solving the general situation, it really does have some interesting possibilities. And there do seem to be some subset of objects that actually fit well within this framework, considered generously. So what did you think about that when you were reading about Bacon?
I appreciate that you brought up the sense of smell. I sometimes wonder when these various folks come up with their various theories, if we also, in some ways, get a little bit of a sense of who they are. And some people, I think you've probably experienced, some people have a heightened sense of smell, other people not so much. And that actually sometimes tells you something a little bit about who they are. And I think it's probably true with other senses, too, that some of us have or are a little more in tune with certain senses. And you just wonder whether somebody like Roger Bacon was just really in tune with that. And in some ways, that theory just makes so much sense when it comes, and we know that there's some basis in reality. And so now, without necessarily having all of even the ability to do the kind of experimentation that we do or in the models to understand things like photons and things like that, there is a little bit of a sense in which, hey, he maybe perhaps understood a little bit how the sense of smell works. And you like to think a guy like Roger Bacon, maybe he liked to cook good food like bacon and smell it. But there is a sense in which we also get a sense of the people and what they're, just as in the same way you have the trope of Newton and the apple and helped him with gravity. And you get why there is a sense in which we often take the specific and try to generalize it. And there's a little bit of that. Maybe that's what happened here. But it is also very useful at times to take a specific case and try to generalize it. And then you experiment and see if that works. And to some extent, that's a very simplified version of how the scientific method works. You take a hypothesis, and often you're taking something specific you've observed, you're creating a more general hypothesis out of it, and then you're testing. There's a little bit of that even just in this. And so while today we recognize that Bacon's theory doesn't necessarily work with other things, we understand a little bit differently how light works and things like that. And we're not necessarily producing emanations of light from our bodies. It's more about reflection and things like that. And yet there's a sense in which even that idea of reflection, you can see how you can get there from somebody like Bacon. So I found that to be very interesting. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because as I was thinking about Bacon's idea of this continuous irradiation, that right away came to my mind was this is a guy who understood the sense of smell, and maybe he had maybe more highly attuned nose things. He might have been one of those guys who could smell a glass of wine and understand a little bit more about it, or those kinds of things, because it does work that way.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. And one other perhaps potential application of Bacon's idea of irradiation. And admittedly, this is a stretch, but the point is that if you take them loosely or if you take them generously, you can often see insight that maybe wasn't so obvious in a more restrictive setting. So you mentioned Bacon and the idea of smell, and I just thought that was perfect. I loved it. Of course, I wouldn't expect Bacon to have had an insight in a particular area that has only come about since his day. But I was thinking about this idea of your digital digital footprint. So, Chuck, you and I are citizens living in a time where we have an online presence and we leave behind these perceptive memories, these perceptive stimuli, these imprints in the internet, in the ether of our presence and what we are thinking and what we are like. And somebody who's never been online and who's never used the internet, of course, has left behind in the internet no stimulus, no effect. It's as if, from the internet's perspective, they never existed. Whereas you and I, as people who've used the internet significantly, we might have a very substantial digital footprint that, dare I say it, in some sense, perhaps radiates out into the universe. Now, of course, I'm taking some liberties here. I don't know that we could call these emanations in the Bacon sense. Clearly not. You think about how a digital detective would try to piece together records of various digital occurrences online to be able to put together a profile, say, for example, to try to find a criminal or to try to find a person of interest in some forensic matter. All of a sudden, Bacon doesn't quite seem so silly there. So we have to ask, are we stretching into an unhealthy application? Have we taken Bacon so far out of where he himself was that it is in some sense nonsensical? Possibly. But that's precisely the field we're in trying to understand these representations. And so you can see that even theories that are easy to dismiss as cartoonish may still yet yield great insight. And so that's the point that I wanted to make with that. And that's also the point, that's the kind of thing we're going to be able to find with almost each one of the other medieval thinkers. Other folks in this chapter, Thomas Aquinas is going to be a big contributor here, as well as William of Ockham, others. And we're always going to be able to find something that we can critically and dismissively say, oh, boy, look at Aquinas here. That's pretty stupid of him. Or, oh, I don't even know that Occam understood this, that, or the other thing. But if you look in that more generous sense, there's a lot there to admire. And I do admire these thinkers for that. So let me throw it over to you, Chuck, for any last thoughts on this section for today.
Yeah, not a lot more. It is interesting, as you were talking about the way that we leave our digital in and how people who are trying to do detective work or trying to conduct a forensic analysis of things now have those kinds of imprints or those kinds of emanations that we've left available. And it is interesting reading a novel, Anthony Horowitz, a British novelist, and his form that he's taken is he writes these novels within a novel. And in both of his books that I've read, I'm reading the second one that I've read by him. What he does is in the middle of the book, there is a separate novel that has been written, and it's novels that are written modern day Agatha Christie type novels. But then you learn that what the writer has written out in the novel in the surrounding narrative has an impact on the real world as well. And I found it interesting that even just both his concept of these books having an impact on what happens in real life is as an emanation, but then he actually explores that a little bit in talking about how detective work has changed and how in Agatha Christie's days, or Atticus Finn's day, to take the name of the detective that the author writes about, the type of detective work that they did was very different. And now today, because we have all of these sort of ripples in the world, it's a very different kind of work that's being done, following these ripples and trying to determine, having tons of data available that we didn't have before. So I don't know, that's just really interesting. And it's a way that we can turn some of the sometimes dry, I didn't find it particularly dry, but some people might, philosophical musings into something that actually can be rather entertaining in the real world. And this idea of emanations going beyond smell, but going on to digital print and other areas is an interesting one. And I think we see that a little bit. I wonder whether we use terminology like the ripple effect. And you just wonder whether some of that language that we use has maybe its earlier basis in some of these kinds of concepts. And to still today, even though we wouldn't say that Bacon's theory applies to everything, we wouldn't say that the ripple effect is the way that all of reality relates to each other. It's not that every object is constantly emanating these ripples, into the universe, yet they become a part of our general common sense, the way we live in the world, because they make sense in certain ways. They make sense in a general way, even if they don't always go to every step. And so it's really useful to think about that as well. And Yeah, I'm looking forward to thinking about some of the rest of this chapter as well and looking at some of these somewhat different theories. And again, I think we'll find that besides Bacon had these theories, and we find them a little bit unusual today, but Aquinas and Occam and others as well, we're not going to find complete agreement with them as well. But we're also going to find things that really assist us in thinking about perception and thinking about things and how do we create these mental representations things and use them as human beings. I think we'll find a lot that's useful. So many interesting things that, to use the language that we use, that emanate from our discussion and from our thinking about these, it's just really enjoyable.
Amen, my friend. Amen. Thanks for a great discussion. And
that's a really joyful and blessed time for you and for your family.
Thank you, my friend. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.